Hello there, lovely folks of YouTube. Ren here, and of course my friend Hades, who has to be here with me because it's nice out today. First off, I want to say in advance, I'm going to apologize if there are any sound issues. It is very windy today. There's a lull in the wind right now, but hopefully we'll get through this without it gusting, but I can't guarantee that. Because it's so windy, I actually have my little talking points right here. I want to talk about this plant that I am sitting amongst right here. This is Vinca, specifically, gosh, you're so creepy, Vinca minor. There are a few different plants here in the United States that we call by the name Vinca. Only a couple of them are actually Vinca though. So Vinca is actually the genus name. Hades, seriously. So Vinca major and Vinca minor both look very similar to each other. I'm going to actually grab some here because there's plenty of it. See if I can get a piece that has flower on it. It's going to grow back easily. So Vinca minor, like I said, is this one. Periwinkle is actually one of the common names of this plant. And you can see why, because of that little flower right there. Vinca major looks a lot like this, just the leaves are bigger and the flowers are bigger. Now the third plant that we sometimes call Vinca is not actually a Vinca at all. It's also sometimes called Madagascar Vinca, which is, hang on, Catharanthus is the genus on that one. So that one is not actually a Vinca. It is grown sometimes as an annual, but it's actually, although it has a similar looking flower and leaves, it's actually a very different plant from this one. So Vinca major and Vinca minor are both trailing ground cover vines. They only grow to about 6 inches in height, as you can see here. It's not super tall. It does have these little, vines and then the nodes that it makes, these little leaf nodes. It will actually root along the ground on those nodes, which means it is a very aggressive spreader. And it is considered to be invasive in a lot of parts of the United States. So if you do plant this plant, you need to be very careful about where you put it, because it will spread in the right conditions and it will spread out of control. I have mine in an area where it's basically surrounded and kept in check by a lot of other plants in most places. And in the front where it spreads to, it gets kept in check by the mowing of my lawn. But anyway, major is more aggressive in spreading than minor, so that one generally we don't even recommend you plant it at all because it's just so aggressive. But minor can be grown under the right conditions if you're careful with it. They are perennial, so these glossy green leaves that you see here, it keeps these throughout the year. So even in the winter, it will stay green, which is nice. It's a nice little evergreen ground cover. Which is part of the reason why it's so attractive. It makes these little periwinkle colored flowers in the spring. This is where we get, like, I don't know if you ever had the Crayola box when you were a kid and one of the crayons was called Periwinkle, and you can see why. It's basically that color. But sometimes the flowers can be a more purple color or even white. This is the most common color right here, is this sort of like pale blue color. Flowers most prolific in the spring, but it will occasionally and sporadically flower throughout the summer. This is ideally a shade plant. It grows really well in full shade. It grows okay in partial shade. It doesn't really like the sun. It gets burnt real bad in the sun. So anytime you have need for a shade ground cover, this is a good choice as long as you're willing to fight it to keep it in place, which I do have to do sometimes. Because it only grows so high, you can actually plant other plants amongst it, as long as, of course, those plants are taller. You can see, like right here, I have one of my roses grows amongst the periwinkle and is fine because the periwinkle doesn't actually go up like some ground covers like ivies will actually grow up the trunks of trees. This plant doesn't do that. It only stays along the ground, so it is beneficial for that. You can plant other plants amongst it, and they will be fine as long as they have enough verticality to get above where the periwinkle is. Now, let's see. Let's talk about some of the magical properties. So, first off, this is a plant that's usually ascribed to Venus, but there are parts of it that are Saturn. And this is a really interesting plant because this is one where you can see where the different parts really have the different energies to it. The Venus parts are more of the aerial parts, so the flowers and the leaves. The Saturn parts are the stems themselves, that trailing stem that will grow along the ground and sort of bind the ground in place. The name Vinca actually comes from the Latin vincio, which means to bind, so you can see where that Saturn energy really comes into the vines here. So the vines are really good for binding magics. So if you have something that needs binding or holding in place, the vines would be really good for that kind of spell work. The rest of the plant, of course, being Venus plant, is considered to be good for love spells. So these flowers in particular were often used in love spells as well. One of the common names for this plant in some places is actually called Sorcerer's Violet, because it was considered to be a very potent magical plant to really sort of enhance any kind of magical workings. A lot of protection qualities ascribed to this plant, in particular from protection from poisons and beasts. There were also a lot of exorcism qualities, where basically like putting a wreath of Vinca on someone is considered a good way to exorcise or, you know, evil, just drive out evil influences from them and protect them from evil. So of course you can make a wreath or garland for protection of a person or of a home. The flowers, like I said, they can be used in love magics, but they're also considered to be a good source for sort of enhancing the potency of your spell work. So you can use it in really any kind of spell work that you have in order to sort of enhance its working, to protect the magic of that working, and just make sure you're bringing in sort of beneficial energies to that working. Now, the other interesting quality about this plant is that sometimes one of the common names of this plant is flower of death. This was a plant that was commonly planted on graves, especially graves of children. And one of the reasons is that, of course, it was considered to kind of help, two reasons. It was to help hold the dead in place, to make sure that they couldn't try to get up and get back into the world again, and also help to ease their transition into the next world. So that's another good use for it. What that means is that if you see this plant out somewhere about in the forest, the woods, and the wild, unkempt places, odds are that there probably was a grave planted nearby at some point in history. So you find this plant a lot in the graveyards as well, particularly the older graveyards. So that's another reason. That's another use for this plant. Very, very interesting magical plant that a lot of people have and don't even realize is a magical plant. I grew up with this stuff growing everywhere. In my mother's yard, I got it from her, which is why I have it in my yard. I was just like, oh yeah, it's a really nice ground cover. It has these pretty flowers in the spring, not realizing it had so much magical history to it. So, really, really neat plant. Very magical plant that a lot of people don't even consider. So, if you have the space for it and you can keep it in control and you know that it won't get aggressive, it's a good idea to have in your little shady spots. So, there we go. Isn't that cool? I mean, I just love it. I love how we can have so many deeply magical plants right under our feet and not even know it. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. So, anyway, that's all I have for today. Hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.